Hello there. So to start, I want to welcome everybody to our webinar presentation of vaccines, both myths and facts. My name is Trevor Maurer. I'm a pediatrician at Mary Rutan Hospital Pediatrics. And to break our presentation down, so first, the goals of what we're going to discuss here. So we're going to quell any fears about vaccines and try to inform on the facts behind vaccines and why to vaccinate. Our presentation is going to be divided into a couple different sections. We'll talk about the history of vaccines, how vaccines work and why they're beneficial, and how vaccines are made, and then what side effects can you expect from a vaccine in terms of what's common, what's not common, both serious side effects as well as more mild side effects. We're also going to address a lot of those along the way, a lot of those myths and common fears that, at least as a pediatrician, I encounter from parents in the office when they ask me about vaccines. So first, a little bit about the history of vaccines. So to start, vaccines are one of the most beneficial and cost-effective disease prevention measures ever devised in history. I mean, if you want to think about this, vaccines are cheap and easy to make. They're not like a lot of medications that require some sort of synthetic process of manufacture. These are produced essentially from live organisms, bacteria, or not live organisms like viruses, and they're used to create an immune response that's lasting. So unlike an antibiotic, which would have to be given repeatedly to prevent an infection, a vaccine produces immunity that can be lifelong. So some of the diseases that have been eradicated by vaccines include smallpox. We've nearly eradicated polio, meaning essentially here in the United States you don't see polio, and there are certain areas of the world where you do, but they're usually areas that are like third world countries, which we're currently actively trying to eradicate polio. And then there's other diseases that we may just not see in the US, but are a little more prevalent in other places of the world, like measles and rubella. So since the advent of vaccines, we've seen a greater than 99% reduction in morbidity for most of the diseases that we vaccinate for. So if you look at all the different vaccines you get, the diseases that we are vaccinating against, we see greater than 99% reduction in both the hospital costs in terms of hospitalizations from those vaccines, as well as the mortality in terms of people dying from those diseases, and lifelong morbidity. So if you take the example of something like polio, we no longer have children in the United States who are paralyzed, and dealing with the medical cost of then caring for them after that, helping them to breathe if they're paralyzed to the point of not being able to breathe on their own. Edward Jenner is credited with kind of being one of the first people to create a vaccine, even though he pretty much based his research on something that people had already kind of discovered on their own. So what he did was he's credited with inventing the smallpox vaccine back in 1796. At the time, it involved taking a scraping from a person who had been infected with cowpox, which is a similar disease, and inoculating or infecting a healthy person with that same scraping. The antibody response to that cowpox inoculation then was able to protect a person from subsequently getting smallpox. So in other words, being infected with cowpox, which was a far more mild disease in a person, then led to some protection against smallpox, which is a very similar virus. He discovered this because people had noticed over time that milkmaids weren't susceptible to getting smallpox, that they were less likely to have any sort of severe illness or to die from the disease. Now, if you look at this time in England, 60% of the population would get smallpox. So this was a very prevalent disease. Lots of people got it. And as many as 20% of those people would die from the disease, most of them children. In the 1950s then, scooching ahead in future, that's when we devised the polio vaccine. So in the 1950s, polio cases began to surge, leading to about 60,000 cases per year in children and up to 3,200 deaths per year, also leaving thousands more paralyzed from the condition. And most of these were children. Because of the vaccine that was developed in the 1950s to eradicate polio or to fight polio, we have effectively gotten rid of it in the United States. So, I mean, if you want to look at that, that's a huge disease burden that we no longer see in the US, that we're no longer dealing with because of vaccines. And so this kind of brings me to one of the myths that I commonly hear is that, ultimately vaccines aren't helpful. Vaccines don't prevent disease. This is just, we essentially are exaggerating that ultimately, people are healthier nowadays because of washing hands and running water and that sort of thing. Well, if you think about the 1950s weren't, an era where we didn't have running water. We had ready access to medicine and medication, and you were still seeing heavy disease burden from something like polio. And so ultimately vaccines have made a huge impact on human life expectancy, especially in children. If you look back to, the 1800s, it was extremely common. Essentially everybody who had, multiple kids was more than likely to have lost a child because of an infectious disease that we currently vaccinate for. Hello there. All right, so on to vaccines and how do they work? So one common misconception that people often have about vaccines is that they're just like other medications. Medications like antibiotics, for example, are usually derived either synthetically, meaning we make them in a lab using essentially biochemistry and organic chemistry to manufacture this substance. Or, we have some other organism that produces them. For example, things like penicillins, were originally found to be from certain types of fungus, bread molds specifically. So we derived this chemical from them, and then we're putting this foreign substance into our bodies to then kill bacteria. So vaccines are very different. Vaccines target usually one specific substance, one specific organism, virus, bacteria, and they utilize your own immune system to create an immune response so that your body can then fight off the virus or bacteria. So in other words, it helps to make your body's immune system function better against an illness. I oftentimes will hear people say, I want to get my flu shot because I don't want to get sick this winter. Well, and they kind of broadly use that, like if getting your flu shot's going to prevent, any illness or disease. Or they'll say, oh, the flu shot didn't work this year, I still got sick. Well, that doesn't mean the flu vaccine didn't work. The flu vaccine specifically targets seasonal influenza. So it doesn't target any other respiratory disease like the common cold or other things that you may contract during the winter season. So you're still likely to get sick just because, let's just face it, during cold and flu season, if you're around other people who are sick, there's lots of people who are getting other cold viruses, not just influenza. But the vaccine does specifically target that virus to try to prevent it. So viruses target specific bacteria and viruses and utilize your own immune system to help you to fight those infections. When a person is infected with a virus, their body has special cells called B lymphocytes. These B lymphocytes, their sole duty or job is to recognize a target in terms of a protein or a marker on the outside of a virus or a bacteria. And then they produce their own proteins called antibodies. These antibodies then are essentially like labels that attach themselves to viruses and bacteria and can then help the body to recognize foreign substances. So antibodies are circulating in your bloodstream constantly, all the time, and they're produced by these B cells. Once your B cells have recognized a certain virus, bacteria, or thing that they see as foreign, then they produce these antibodies kind of steadily. Those antibodies bind to something, it's going to be that particular virus or bacteria, and then it kind of raises the alarm bells. It tells your immune system to send other cells that help to kill bacteria or viruses or attack them to come to this place, come to this area of the body and get rid of this. So antibodies help your body to recognize infection before it even has a chance to make any sort of significant impact. And that's what we're doing with vaccines. By vaccinating you, we are presenting your body with a piece or a part of a virus or bacteria so that your body mounts an immune response, so that those B cells try to create antibodies to then alert your body to that type of virus or bacteria. And if we can create this response before you ever even come in contact with that infection, then that infection won't ever have a chance to get off the ground. So if you already have those antibodies circulating in your body, even if you get exposed to measles, then your body is immediately going to target it and get rid of that virus before it even has a chance to cause serious disease. All right, so then vaccines are actually teaching your immune system to fight an infection without the risk of actually having to have that infection. And then the memory of those B cells is propagated. So B cells, as they die and replenish, so they're essentially passing along their information to make those particular antibodies to their next generation of B cells. And so this propagates itself, and you can have immunity secondary to vaccines then for, years to even your entire life. And the degree of your immunity kind of just depends on the reaction that you have to that vaccine, which is why some vaccines can cause a little bit more in terms of side effects, because the side effects because of a vaccine are actually due to your immune system becoming activated. If you think about it, every time you're sick, if you get the common cold, how do you feel? You feel kind of run down and tired, little crummy feeling, that's your body's immune system. If you develop a fever, that's also your immune system. Fevers are used by the body to activate certain proteins in the body and also to slow the certain proteins that bacteria and viruses use to replicate. So a fever can in itself be a good thing. It's not necessarily a negative. Now, obviously, something like a fever makes you feel crummy, which is why we recommend, treating it if somebody's feeling bad, to try to get that temperature down. But in terms of the reaction to these vaccines, you can develop lifelong immunity because of a vaccine, if the reaction is brisk enough. So a myth that I commonly hear from parents, or something that I have a concern that they will have, is that the vaccines that kids get nowadays is just too much. That we need to break shots up or delay shots because it's just there's too many things at one time. Their immune system can't handle it. And what I want to tackle here is that, first and foremost, your immune system can handle pretty much anything. Except for random crazy things that don't occur very often and maybe are trying to slip past your immune system. But when we're talking about something like an immunization, keep in mind these aren't bacteria or viruses in these immunizations that can actually hurt or attack you or cause infection. We're merely just giving your body a bit or a piece of a virus or a bacteria to get it to react to it. Your body every day is fighting infection. You're covered in trillions of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, different types of yeast or fungus, and your body and its cells are outnumbered. So these organisms outnumber your cells 10 to 1. So for every one human cell, you have 10 other microorganisms that are essentially attempting to attack and invade your body, and create potentially an infection. And so your immune system is constantly keeping this in check. It's keeping it in balance. So when we talk about giving vaccines, if you're giving just a handful of vaccines at one time, how is that any worse than what your body handles on a regular basis? The load of of infection and potential danger that your body has to endure is nothing. I mean, it's what your body has to endure for a vaccine is nothing compared to that day-to-day battle. So the other thing that's concerning is that, you know, people talking about wanting to break up vaccine schedules. Why is that bad? Well, if you look at the way the vaccine schedule is devised, I mean, I can show you kind of the way it's set up, vaccines, at what time you get them. There's certain intervals at which you're supposed to get each vaccine. And then there's like a list a mile long of different appendices as to how to give those vaccines in terms of timing, how many weeks after each dose the next dose needs to be, how you can't mix certain vaccines at the same time, so certain vaccines can't be given together for one reason or another, or beyond or after a certain time or before a certain age. And so the rules in terms of when you can give vaccines are extremely cumbersome to try to understand. And so when people say, oh, I just want to space them out, well, can't we just space them out? And I ask them, well, what do you want to do? And they're like, I don't know. What can we just get one today and one later on? And it's like, that may sound easy, but it's not easy. And in fact, the other problem that occurs with it is the reason the vaccine schedule is devised the way that it is to protect you from those diseases when you are at most risk of having a severe infection. So, you know, infants are, you know, essentially at highest risk for serious illness compared to other kids, which is why babies get more vaccines than older children, because they are at highest risk for more serious infections. If you look year to year in terms of mortality related to different diseases, like say influenza, it's generally young infants that are most heavily hit. Things like respiratory syncytial virus or RSV, same thing. So that's the population that we really want to protect, which is why you get those vaccines early. And they're also the population which has certain things that kind of impair their immunity. So babies, in terms of their immune system is just developing. They don't have the ability to make their own antibodies right out the gate. Babies actually have most of their antibody protection from their mother at birth. So their mom's antibodies are in their body and circulating for the first 6 months of life before their own B cells, which we had mentioned earlier, can then start to make their own antibodies. So in the first few months, you get so many vaccines simply just because we're just giving you the same things over and over again. You know, your 2-month, 4-month, 6-month vaccines are essentially all repeats of one another, because that baby's immune system can't remember after the first vaccine to keep those antibodies for the next time. So we're just boosting that immunity each time. We're giving them the same vaccine again to just help their immune system to remember it, to get those B cells to try to remember what it is we want them to remember. So giving vaccines off schedule puts young children at risk for disease, because if we aren't boosting their immunity when their immunity is waning, and then they're not protected, then they're at risk for things like meningitis, pneumonia, pertussis, tetanus, things that could be potentially dangerous. All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit about how do you make vaccines. So like I mentioned, we're trying to present your body with bits or pieces of bacteria or viruses to teach your body to defend itself. In the cases of bacteria, this can be essentially pretty easy, because bacteria are a little more complex than a virus. Bacteria are, they've got multiple different parts to them, even if they are just one single cellular organism. They have lots of different outer proteins around them, protecting them and helping them to invade human cells. So proteins and polysaccharides, which polysaccharides are just sugar molecules. And these proteins and polysaccharides are on the outside of bacteria, and a lot of the time they'll have a polysaccharide essentially shell to protect them from our own immune system. And so these things make good targets for our body. If we can just take one of those little pieces and present it to the immune system can react to it. Those B cells can make antibodies to that protein. or polysaccharide. And then those antibodies, if they ever see that bacteria, will be able to latch on and then create an immune response. So in the cases of things like, say, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, which are all in your DTaP vaccination, all of those are bacteria. And those 3 bacteria or bacterial organisms all create a toxin. That the toxin that they produce is actually what causes the illness and makes you sick. So the toxin is a great target. We actually use the toxin as the target for the vaccine. And so you target the toxin production. You grow these bacteria and allow them to produce toxin, and then we kill the bacteria. We get rid of it using substances like formaldehyde, so chemical agents that we know are going to sterilize or kill microorganisms like bacteria. So you use that to kill the bacteria, and then you purify it out. So you take out the toxin that you want. And once we separate that all out, we've got the protein that we want to target, the toxin protein, and then that is essentially utilized in the vaccine then to create that immune response. Now that protein, oftentimes we use other things to try to boost the immune reaction. So we will attach that protein to like a polysaccharide chain, a sugar chain that can then boost the response of the immune system to those things. And is this, I just mentioned adding formaldehyde and purifying this all down. This is the process where a lot of people will then raise questions. Well, okay, so there's formaldehyde in vaccines? And yes, there is. Subtle, small amounts, because any purification technique can't be 100%. So anytime we're producing something like this, you're never going to get 100% elimination of all impurity. But you can get darn close. You can get 99.9% close. So yes, is there trace amounts of formaldehyde in some vaccines? Absolutely. But you know what? Your body actually produces formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is a byproduct of our cells' natural production of energy. And your body already, on a daily basis, is getting rid of this formaldehyde. So the amount that you're getting in a vaccine is minuscule. Your body already knows how to handle it and get rid of it. And inside of 30 minutes, it's gone after you've received a vaccine. So this isn't a concern. People act like it is a concern because they're worried about chemicals that are in vaccines. And it's like, no, this is not something that's any different than your body deals with on a regular basis. And there's a lot of other substances that we'll talk about down the road that are very similar that people will raise concerns about in vaccine, but yet we don't raise concerns about them when they're in other foods, products that we eat, things like that, that don't harm us and won't harm us because our body actually either already produces these things or deals with these things on a regular basis. It's nothing that is, say, unnatural for our body to have to do. All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit about how do you make vaccines. Next we'll talk a little bit about viruses then. So how do we make vaccines to viruses? So viruses are very simple organisms. They're usually just a protein capsid surrounding some DNA or RNA, which is genetic material. Viruses aren't very complex. They're not even really considered living creatures because they don't have the ability to move on their own or that sort of thing. They really just, all they do is replicate and create more virus. So viral targets are sometimes things like proteins or polysaccharides that may be on the capsid itself that are easy targets, just like with a bacteria. So there are some viruses we can target that way. Hepatitis B and the HPV virus are targeted that way. So if you get a Hep B or HPV vaccine, it's essentially just targeting a little tiny piece of those viruses and trying to get your body to make an immune response to that specific target. But then other times, we can't find a target. There's not like a specific small piece that we can use that will create enough of an immune response to have an antibody that can then target that virus or effectively eliminate that virus. And in these cases, sometimes we have to use the entire virus. So if you take the example of things like measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and the chickenpox vaccine, we're actually using a live virus. So when you get a chickenpox vaccine, you're getting vaccinated with a live chickenpox virus that's in that vaccine. What's different about it, though, is that it's not the same as a regular chickenpox that virus. Like, if you get chickenpox, we all know the disease characteristics, getting, covered in those tiny red pustules. When you get the vaccine virus, it's weakened. It doesn't have the ability to replicate. And that's really how viruses cause illness, is by just replicating. A virus invades your body's cells and then replicates itself thousands of times. It essentially takes over the cell's machinery. So inside every cell is the ability to make more proteins, to make energy, and viruses hijack cells, replicate to make thousands of more copies until they essentially bust open the cell and destroy it. And then all those little viral particles are then released, and then they go and do the same thing to other cells. So this is how viruses cause damage to our body. This is how they lead to intense immune responses, because our body's trying to get rid of all these tiny little critters, essentially, that are attacking our cells. So in the case of some of these viruses, the easiest way to make them inactive is to just take away their genetic ability to replicate. So we using genetics can essentially take something like a chickenpox virus and create a very, very weakened chickenpox virus that, instead of being able to replicate itself thousands of times in a hurry, now it can only do it 10 times. And so that's not going to be enough to cause any sort of serious illness or disease. And so once we've created a virus like that is so weakened, well, then it makes a perfect constituent for a vaccine. It's something that we can easily use to vaccinate people, because it still in every way, shape, and form looks like the chickenpox virus, but it doesn't have the ability to really cause any illness. And so these types of vaccines are called inactivated live virus vaccines, or attenuated viral vaccines. And so again, examples of that would be your measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination and your chickenpox vaccine. The nasal flu vaccine also is a live virus vaccine. And these vaccines are very effective. In the cases of MMR and the chickenpox vaccine, you're talking, when you get those vaccines, you are immunized for life. Like, it prevents infection in the future. In the case of the chickenpox vaccine, it reduces the incidence of shingles later on in life. But what's important with those live attenuated vaccines is that we know that, again, there is still some ability for them to replicate and to cause disease. So in somebody with a very, very, very extremely weak immune system, somebody who's, say, undergoing chemotherapy, where we're essentially destroying their immune system, well, they can't get these live viral vaccines. And so they won't get that protection if they haven't already gotten it in the past. And those are the things that we have to keep in mind when giving these vaccines, is that there is always a certain population that maybe can't benefit from a vaccine or could potentially be harmed from something like that. All right, so next we'll talk a little bit about viruses then. So this is where I'll tackle kind of another myth. So with the flu vaccine, I mentioned that the nasal vaccine is a live attenuated viral vaccine, but most often, a lot of us get the shot. So the influenza shot is actually a killed virus. There is no live virus in that. You're just using bits and pieces of the virus, like I had mentioned beforehand. And so there's no ability for that to cause influenza, for that vaccine to lead to you getting the flu. And so this is a myth that I hear all the time. Oh, well, I got the flu after I got the flu shot, so I don't get it anymore. And I can tell you probably 70-80% of the time when I ask people what they got afterwards, what they are considering the flu, a lot of people give me symptoms of a stomach virus. So they start talking about how they were vomiting and had diarrhea, which are not symptoms of seasonal influenza. Seasonal influenza is a respiratory disease. Yes, it can cause vomiting from time to time, but it's usually just sporadic. It's not like when you get a stomach virus and you're, retching and dry heaving for 12 hours. And likewise, while you can get some mild diarrhea with the influenza virus, it's not, the diarrhea is usually more because of people not eating and only drinking fluids. It's not persistent, large volume diarrhea, again, like you get in gastroenteritis. So viral gastroenteritis, which a lot of people like to generically term the stomach flu, has absolutely no relationship to seasonal influenza at all. And so there is this misconception when people get a stomach virus, if they had gotten the flu vaccine in the last week or 2 or 3, they attribute it to the flu vaccine. They say, oh, I got the flu anyway. And that's really not the case. It's not seasonal influenza. So from that standpoint, you cannot get the flu from the flu vaccine. Now, if you get the live attenuated flu virus vaccine, the nasal vaccine, can you get the flu from that? Well, at least from what we've seen, no, not really. So that flu vaccine is not recommended for young children. It's also not recommended for people who have a weakened immune system. So again, people undergoing chemotherapy, right? So those would be the people that would be at most risk for potentially having a more serious disease from that weakened virus. What you do tend to see is, just like with any other vaccine, typical side effects. And so that's what we're going to talk about. When we talk about side effects, what things are common? Well, we always describe side effects from a vaccine as flu-like symptoms. What does flu-like symptoms mean? Flu-like symptoms is just our term for vague symptoms, just multiple body systems involved, and just it usually just means that you feel a little run down, you feel like you have less energy, you feel tired, you maybe have some body aches or pains, and you might have a fever associated with that. And so if you get a vaccine, most vaccines, if you look at it, cause those types of symptoms. They cause potential for a fever, feeling tired, loss of appetite. Some of them list something like vomiting on there too as a possibility, because it just, in general, when people feel crummy, sometimes it does make them nauseous, and that can lead to vomiting. In terms of other reactions you can see from vaccines, you can see things like fainting, for example. That's not a common symptom, and it's not really necessarily because of the vaccine. It has more to do with people having syncope. And so, there are people who have needle phobia or fear of needles, just like people who have fear of blood, for example. And these people, when they see things like, if they see blood or if they see a needle, they can pass out. And it's the same thing with getting a shot. That whole experience leads to the symptoms of feeling like they're gonna faint or pass out. And so this can be prevented simply by just making sure people are sitting or lying down for about 15 minutes after they've gotten a vaccine. So try not to get up right away and rush out of the office right after your shot. Making sure people are adequately taking care of themselves. This is why we don't like giving vaccines to people who are sick. Somebody who's already been ill and is maybe dehydrated should not get a vaccine. We want them to be feeling well when they get it, because we don't want to cause any other symptoms. Other things that you can see with vaccines. So I mentioned that there's lots of just generic, simple symptoms that people tend to get. That's the more common thing. And I would say even then, if you're talking about things like feeling under the weather, feeling tired, they usually last 1, maybe 2 days at a max after a vaccine before it's gone. And the majority of children, in my own experience, don't have any symptoms after vaccines. Fever is not a common thing. You don't see fever in all kids. You're talking like maybe 5 to 10%, depending on the vaccination. And so that's, most kids do not have a fever at all after vaccines. Your more serious side effects that people hear about and freak out about or worry about. So vaccines can cause an anaphylactic reaction. So you can have essentially a severe allergic reaction. That's what anaphylaxis is. That's where people talk about like difficulty breathing and throat swelling and their face swelling up, getting hives all over, going into shock. Anaphylaxis is possible after a vaccine, just like it's possible after ingesting any substance. Just like anytime you eat a peanut or eat a tree nut, you could, develop an allergic reaction to it. We don't know. There's certain people who are set up for allergic reactions to things like that, and you can base it on their family history possibly, but it doesn't mean that you want to avoid those things. They just happen randomly, just like it happens randomly with vaccines. In fact, it happens so randomly, it only happens less than 1 in a million. So that's extremely rare. And those cases that we do see of anaphylaxis are not life-threatening. Usually those people do wind up being fine. So we don't see people dying from anaphylaxis from vaccines. Other things, severe reactions that can happen with vaccines or are associated with vaccines. So in the past, there have been reports of Guillain-Barré syndrome. That was with a particular flu vaccine back in the 70s that was preventing a specific type of flu that year. And there are cases every now and then reported. Guillain-Barré is a paralyzing condition, but it's a self-resolving and self-limited paralyzing condition. So while that's very scary, nobody would say paralysis is a non-scary thing. It's more of a rheumatologic condition. So it has more to do not with the vaccine itself so much as your body's immune reaction to that vaccine. For whatever reason, in some people, they're predisposed to this and they can actually develop this condition. This occurs on a level of, again, maybe 1 or 2 in a million. So not a common occurrence. And we really don't even know if vaccines are the potential trigger or cause in all cases, because there's a laundry list of things that are associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome, including just getting those diseases. So getting influenza can cause potentially Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's so rare, we don't really know what causes it. Encephalopathy is another thing. So that's more associated with the DTaP vaccine. So, and it actually was more associated with the old school DTaP vaccine. So currently the way that our DTaP vaccine is produced is it's an acellular pertussis vaccine. Back in the day, we didn't purify it down to specific components of pertussis. You got whole cell pertussis. So there was a much more vigorous immune response, which is why a lot of people, back in the times when we use it, so the 80s, 70s, would have a fever after their DTaP vaccine. It was very likely to see that. Well, at least more likely than it is today. And encephalopathy was something that was listed as a potential side effect, severe side effect of that. So encephalopathy means, seizures, brain swelling, that sort of thing. This is not something that we really see anymore with the use of the acellular pertussis vaccine. And there's a lot of debate as to whether or not it was really secondary to the DTaP vaccine or secondary to other illnesses or infections at the time that we just didn't know about, that over time now we do, and we do treat. Or certain conditions in infants that we didn't know about then that we do treat now. So there's lots of different metabolic diseases and conditions that babies can have where at birth they seem normal and seem fine, but then can lead to severe collapse and shock and essentially encephalopathy after the fact if they aren't discovered. And these are all things that we test for nowadays in the newborn screen. So there's a lot of thought that maybe those rare and random cases of encephalopathy had nothing to do with the DTaP vaccine, and in fact are more attributable to other conditions. And so how often does this occur? And again, this is less than 1 in a million. So your chance of a serious reaction to a vaccine is exceedingly rare. Your chance of having a serious complication from one of the diseases that vaccines prevent is far more common than getting a severe reaction to a vaccination. The diseases themselves cause far more deaths. If you look at the diseases we vaccinate against currently, they prevent roughly 2 to 3 million deaths every year worldwide. Despite this success, we still are seeing that there's roughly 1.5 million people in the world that do die from vaccine preventable disease because we haven't gotten vaccines to those areas. That's a lot of people. If you look annually as to the number of people who potentially have died from a vaccine, and this is just people reporting what they think may have been the vaccine, you're looking at on the level in worldwide of few hundred. And this is, again, not that people actually died from the vaccine, but that we think maybe there's a connection. This could be somebody who thinks, okay, my child got a vaccine and then 2 weeks later, something bad happened. And I'm going to say that I think it might be the vaccine. And so that all gets investigated. Believe it or not, there's essentially a site set up called, it's the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. So anytime physicians encounter something that they feel like is a potentially adverse effect of a vaccine, it can be reported, and then those reports each year are investigated. And annually, if they're seeing any trend in terms of adverse events reported about a specific vaccine, those vaccines are then further investigated and researched. And in certain cases, sometimes they're pulled off the market and no longer utilized until we can iron those things out. That happens rarely, because ultimately, vaccines, to get to market, it takes roughly 10 years of research and development. And that's because of the amount of time and cost that it takes to research and to develop the vaccine, but then also to test it and to make sure that it's safe and to get appropriate FDA approval to be able to utilize those vaccines. So these things aren't rushed along and just thrown out there for everybody to get. This is something that takes a long process of people trying to work really hard to make sure this is something that's safe and effective at preventing a disease. So next, so I'm going to start to just talk about general myths otherwise. And so a lot of these myths about vaccines are mostly attributed to like different substances that are in the vaccine, or people have different fears about different substances that are in the vaccine. So one of the more common myths that people come to me with or are concerned about is that thimerosal is in vaccines, and that being a mercury containing preservative is going to cause mercury poisoning in their children. So first and foremost, thimerosal has been no longer utilized in vaccines since the early 2000s. So we don't see thimerosal in vaccines anymore. There's a couple different multi-use vial, meaning that you draw up multiple doses from one vial of flu vaccine that still use it, but all other vaccines don't. And most of the time when we're giving flu vaccines, we use the pre-filled syringes, so they're not a multi-use vial. Despite that, so thimerosal does contain inert mercury. So inert mercury is not the same thing as mercury that's in your thermometer back in the day that was considered poisonous, that if you broke the thermometer, you were told to stay away from that because it can cause poisoning and make you go crazy. So inert mercury is very different. Inert mercury is naturally occurring. This is like the type of mercury that you come into contact with eating certain fish. So if you look at the amount of mercury that used to be used in a vaccine as a preservative in the form of thimerosal, that amount of mercury was the same amount in one vaccine as a 3-ounce can of tuna. So just by eating a can of tuna, you would have received as much mercury as that one vaccine would do. And obviously there have been multiple studies on whether or not tuna is going to cause any problems for you or cause mercury toxicity, and no, it doesn't. Eating potentially mass quantities of tuna in a single day could make you sick, but I think you'd probably get sick of the tuna before you'd get sick from the mercury. And one of the things that people were concerned about too with thimerosal is they were attributing thimerosal to what caused autism. And so that's the other big myth, is that vaccines cause autism. And this is a myth that's been disproven hundreds of times over. So this is one that we need to just lay to rest. There have been over 300 different studies looking at autism and any link to vaccinations. And they all, for the most part, disprove that autism has any link to vaccines. And I say for the most part because, of course, there's random bad studies that are done that maybe don't have enough people involved in the study, meaning that they're not appropriately powered studies. So the power of a study has to do with how many people are in it. And so, a study that has a higher power is one that's going to have, hundreds of thousands of participants involved. One with a very low power is one that maybe has less than 10. So, obviously you can arrange a study poorly and not think about all the different factors involved in it and create some sort of a link, which is what originally happened. So if you look at the original study that showed any sort of link to autism, it was done by a man named Andrew Wakefield, who was a British physician and researcher. And in 1998, he published this study that showed that, he was looking at 12 children who had autism, and he linked their development of autism to them having gotten the MMR vaccine. So they developed autistic features within a month after getting their MMR vaccine. Well, number one, he was looking at kids who were all around that age of 1 when autism tends to present itself, because obviously autism being a neurodevelopmental condition, meaning that it deals a lot with human behavior, is very difficult to diagnose in a young infant, right? It's very hard to tell that a 2-month-old has autism. But once you're getting to a toddler who's able to communicate and to gesture for things and show you more social skills, you can start to make that diagnosis. And the MMR was given around the same time, right? So we give these vaccines around the same time these children are developing social skills. So he essentially showed this link. And, there was all this hoopla about it. It got lots of media attention too down the road. And so suddenly then everybody's worried about autism and the MMR vaccine, or just vaccines in general. And so, his study was analyzed repeatedly over and over again. And actually, eventually what they found was that he had falsified some of his research to try to create this link. And eventually his article was retracted, meaning that the journal that published it said, you know what, after the fact, there were a lot of things you didn't tell us about what you did that we don't think that your study is valid, and we don't want it in our journal, and we are sorry we published it. So this is the same thing as just like any other media outlet posting a retraction. It's kind of like them really having to dig down deep and, ask for forgiveness for publishing something that was false. Since then, too, again, we've had hundreds of studies involving over 500,000 children at a time, looking at children over time who got vaccinated and children who didn't get vaccinated. And what they show is that the risk for autism is the same in both groups. It doesn't matter. And so we also have lots of research that's come about over time that shows that autism truly is genetic, that this is linked to genetic factors that we can't control. It has more to do with your mom and dad's personality and their genetics than it does anything else. And then there's probably also some environmental factors that play a role too, but we don't know specifically which environmental factors those are. This is all research that still needs to be done to try to figure out a better way to predict which children are going to have autism and how we can prevent it. But we do know that vaccines don't have anything to do with it. Thimerosal, going back to that, after thimerosal was taken out of vaccines, autism rates actually climbed. So if you want to attribute anything to autism, it would be removing thimerosal from vaccines, because once it was actually taken out, that's when we started to see more reports of autism. And probably the biggest reason over time that we've seen autism diagnoses increase is because the criteria for autism have changed over time in terms of when we diagnose it and how we diagnose it. And so for a period there, it was easier to get the diagnosis of autism, and we wanted to make sure that kids who have disabilities get the services that they need. So the last component of vaccines that I was going to talk about, or the last vaccine myth, is regarding aluminum in vaccines. So this is something that I've heard other people mention in the office, parents concerned about there being aluminum in a vaccine. So obviously we're talking about the same aluminum that's in pop cans, and yes, you actually need aluminum in your body. There are certain enzymes that use aluminum to make energy for your body. So aluminum as an element is important for your body to function, but just like anything else, you don't want too much of it, right? So iron is really important to your body too, but you don't want too much iron. It can cause poisoning. Same thing with aluminum. Too much aluminum can cause poisoning. So can aluminum be bad then for a baby if they're getting lots of vaccines that are containing aluminum? No. So if we look at it, aluminum is in not only beverages because of canned things and foods, so canned goods. It's in fruits, vegetables, beer, wine, seasonings, flour, cereals, nuts, dairy products, baby formula, and honey. Most plants actually have low quantities of aluminum, but a few actually are aluminum accumulators. So tea plants used to make tea leaves, grasses, orchids are all aluminum accumulators and accumulate aluminum over time. The typical adult actually ingests 7 to 9 milligrams of aluminum per day. And if you look at infants, so infants being formula fed infants will receive about 4.4 milligrams of aluminum in the first 6 months of life from just their vaccines. Now then, if you look at formula fed and breastfed infants, so a breastfed infant ingests about 7 milligrams over the first 6 months from breast milk. Formula fed babies ingest about 38 milligrams of aluminum over the first 6 months, and babies fed soy formula specifically ingest about 117 milligrams of aluminum in the first 6 months of life. So comparatively, again, vaccines, we're talking about 4.4 milligrams. Just breastfeeding, which is 100% natural, is 7 milligrams. And then other baby formulas is like 4 to 10 times that amount or more. So in other words, aluminum in vaccines is no cause for concern, and it's not an issue. Yes, too much aluminum could potentially cause some sort of poisoning or toxicity, but we're talking not from what you get in vaccines. We're talking about you would have to be ingesting some source of aluminum that's extremely concentrated. Too much aluminum in the body can be a problem in terms of people who have certain types of medical conditions. So people on dialysis whose kidneys can't function appropriately can accumulate something like that, a particular metal like that in their body without having it dialyzed out. And that can be an issue if they eat foods that are really high in it. But that doesn't apply to infants, and that definitely doesn't apply to the amount of aluminum that's in vaccines, which is minuscule compared to the amount of aluminum you're going to get from foods. So that kind of concludes our presentation. I discussed a lot of different myths and the benefits of vaccines. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to let us know. And I hope everybody got something out of it and enjoyed the talk. And take care. Have a good day.